Before we begin this lecture, I want to speak a little about its title. An American empire, yes, but I want you to pay attention to the end mark, the question mark, because this is a common debate throughout history, going all the way back to the revolutionary generation of the 1770s and 1780s. The United States was always considered different from its European forebears. It was never in pursuit of an empire, as were the British, the French, the Spanish, or any other European power. This made it somewhat exceptional in the sense that it was willing to exist peacefully with other nations, not seeking to take over lands. Well, in reality, as we've talked about in past classes, and if you took the first half of this class with me, you would have seen us talk about this then as well, the United States never had to look abroad to create an empire because it had within its grasp its own land-based empire, the continental United States. As you'll see looking throughout history, after the first Europeans landed on the eastern seaboard in the 1500s, they would move, in the 1500 and 1600s, they would move further and further west and create a sort of internal colony. But as we also talked about, and as you read the Frederick Jackson Turner document about the frontier in history, in that same paper, Frederick Jackson Turner talks about this idea that the frontier is now closed in 1892. At least not in the excerpt that you read, but he talks about in a larger paper. So therefore the issue became, what is the United States going to do? If so many great things, at least according to Frederick Jackson Turner, come out of this frontier, democracy, individualism, ingenuity, so on and so forth, as you saw in that document, how is the United States going to maintain those traits when it no longer has access to these lands? Well, what it's going to do is it's going to start looking abroad for new lands. But beyond those sort of theoretical and ideological interests, the other, more basic and common desire was to simply create a marketplace for American goods. And that is, in fact, where I want to start this lecture. Before we start talking about this marketplace, creating this marketplace for American goods, I want to talk about American beliefs and American understandings about its past. This image that we're looking at right in front of us is known as the logo map. And it is, as you can see, a picture of the continental United States. When you ask an American up until the present day, here in the early 21st century, they will say, this is what America looks like. And while that is true, there is some sort of maneuvering going on by using this image, this logo image, as a map of the United States. Because although it is authentic to a degree, it's missing the actual breadth of how big the United States is in actuality. If we want something closer to the truth, perhaps we should look at this map of the greater United States. As you can see, this was a map that was actually quite common in the early 20th century. This comes from Modern School Supply Company in 1919. And this map is important because it goes beyond that sort of logo map of just the continental United States. Most notably, and most easily understood here, is it includes, of course, Alaska, and it includes the Hawaiian Islands, both of which will, at this time in 1919, become territories of the United States. They do not become states until the mid-20th century. But then there are the other areas that most Americans do not yet know about, and these are all in pink. So the biggest, we see the Philippine Islands. We see Puerto Rico. We're going to be talking about both of those when we start talking about the Spanish-American War. But if we look at the map on the right, look to the Pacific Ocean, just to the right of Asia and the north of Australia. You're going to see a bunch of tiny islands that are also under the control of the United States. You see something similar to that on the map on the left, on the far left. It's hard to see on the screen, but they're there in pink. And this has led one historian to describe the United States empire as a pointillist empire. A pointillist empire, meaning that there are these tiny points on a map that most people do not even know about, but nonetheless, they are there. And while the visual maps that we just looked at provide us some clue of the geographical reach of the United States, they don't show us the actual numbers, because what we will see is this. These tiny islands, as small as they are, when combined, do actually add up to a pretty large number of people under the possession and under the control of the United States. So let's look here at U.S. territorial possessions in 1940. The population of the mainland United States, the 48 continental United States, 131.6 million people. Now look at the total population of U.S. territories at this point in 1940. 18.8 million people. 18.8 million people under the control of the U.S. government, which ostensibly is not a U.S. empire, but yet has 18.8 million people under its thumb, if you will. Let's see some of the areas where this is the case. The Philippines, the most notable. Again, we're going to talk about this as well as Puerto Rico later in this class. The Philippines, under the United States control from 1899 to 1946, had about 16.3 million people. Puerto Rico, 1899 to the present, just under 1.9 million people. Hawaii, 423,000 people. Alaska, 72,000 people. The Panama Canal Zone, under the control of the United States from 1904 to 1979, just under 52,000 people. Guam, still under control of the United States, just over 22,000 people. And American Samoa, just under 13,000 people. Therefore, I ask for you to think about this question. Was the United States an empire? Looking at these numbers, when at one point in our history, in 1940 at least, we had 18.8 million people under our control, that sort of leans in the direction of saying, yes, in fact, the United States was an empire. I want to return now to that issue of why. Why did the United States go abroad looking for islands, for land? And a lot of this had to do with America's vastly expanding marketplace. And again, I want to go back to some of our earlier classes when we were talking about expansion and some of the images that we even looked at. The railroads, again, made possible not only the movement of people, but the movement of goods. And more importantly, in talking about the movement of goods, it now made possible the movement from items all the way on the East Coast, all the way to the West Coast. But then what? Was that the end point? Well, in the minds of corporate America, no, it could not stop there. The marketplace had to go abroad and look to that all-important Asian market. And in talking about the encouragement of this sort of thinking, I want to look at one individual's work, and that is the book published in 1890 by Alfred Thayer Mahan. As American industry grew in the late 19th century, the nation's business and political leaders looked for additional outlets for these goods. And again, it would be in Alfred Thayer Mahan's 1890 book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, that they found a defense for their arguments. Now, this book by Mahan was read by several important world leaders, including Theodore Roosevelt, the future President of the United States, who during this time in U.S. history, a little later, will become the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy and a key cheerleader of this expansionism abroad by the United States. But nonetheless, in this book, Mahan explained that America's industrial growth required new markets abroad. But these new markets abroad would in turn require an expansion of America's Navy so that the United States could expand into the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and beyond. As a result of these arguments and the push by industrialists, we see the United States making several moves to open access to foreign markets. First of all, in 1891. In that year, the United States reached an agreement whereby tariffs would be lowered. And when we're talking about tariffs, we're talking about taxes. Tariffs would be lowered on all sugar coming from the Dominican Republic into the United States. But this was only in exchange for the following. By promising to lower the taxes on sugar coming from the Dominican Republic into the United States demanded that all tariffs would be eliminated on U.S. goods entering the Dominican Republic. clearly this was to the benefit of the United States and its industry. At the end of this decade, in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay referred to a new open door policy. The open door policy. What this involved was the demand that all Western powers have access to Chinese markets. Well, the following year, in 1900, the United States joined with other nations to put down the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion actually sought to end foreign businesses and missionaries from entering China, and therefore this was a key challenge to this open door policy promoted by Hayes the prior year. Not surprisingly, the United States would take part in it. But what was surprising was that William McKinley, the President of the United States, did not ask Congress to send in 5,000 U.S. troops to China to quell the uprising. This would be a clear success, however, despite the constitutional problems associated with this, because it says in our Constitution the President is supposed to ask Congress for approval of sending all troops abroad. But nonetheless, it worked, because by 1905, China was the largest overseas market for American oil. Even before all of these exhortations and moves in the 1890s for an expanded American empire abroad, a marketplace abroad, we see efforts to spread America's hands and go into different areas, particularly for resources. And I want to tell this story by looking at something that happens in 1856 with the Guano Islands Act. Guano is simply another way to say bat droppings. Guano means bat droppings. So why did the U.S. Congress pass a piece of legislation having to do with bat droppings in the Pacific Ocean? Well, in 1856, with this act, America could claim Pacific islands with high amounts of guano, or bat droppings, the so-called white gold. It was known as white gold because it was used in fertilizers because of its high nitrogen content. What we see as a result of this act in 1856 was by the following year, in 1857, the United States began annexing small islands throughout the Caribbean and Pacific. By the end of the century, the United States would control 94 small islands that had no indigenous populations, rocky terrain, and received only minimal rainfall. Why did they want these islands, these 94 small islands? Because, again, they had high amounts of guano. But the fact is, they simply took them as their possession without looking to see whether anyone else or any other country had their control. The United States stepped in. So what does this mean? It means that what we see in this image on the right, all the different islands under the control of the United States here by the end of the 19th century. Before talking about the war that will greatly expand America's empire abroad, I want to spend time looking at some of the imagery that was present during this time in U.S. history to sell the idea that America is doing good in the world. But what we see in this image is more of a critique of that imagery and that idea of American exceptionalism. So I want to talk about it briefly. So as you can see, the image on the left, towering over all the other characters on this political cartoon, was Uncle Sam. And as you'll see, we have different classes of students during this time. So first of all, we have the characters in the front. If you can see on their belts, if you will, the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, America's newest colonial possessions. Those characters, those figures, look almost savage, animalistic. What does that mean? Well, it means if you go back to our discussion about Native Americans, they were deemed uncivilized. They still need to be civilized. Uncle Sam is menacingly towering over them, trying to teach them. What is he trying to teach them? Well, it appears that he's trying to teach them ideas of, if you look at that blue book on his desk, self-government. Now, of course, there's some sort of hypocrisy in that. Self-government under the tutelage of the U.S. government, under the control of the U.S. government. But nonetheless, look at behind them. We have other group of students that are more civilized, to use that terminology. And who are they? Well, look at that. They're old states: California, Texas, Arizona. Those states that were picked up during the Mexican-American War in the mid-19th century, after many decades, the United States purportedly improved them and turned them into civilized peoples. But here's a couple other things that I want to point out in this image. We see the Native Americans, to talk about the effort to civilize Native Americans. Well, the Native American in this image, who is in the sort of center of this image, doesn't look like he is very civilized. If you'll notice, he is reading the book upside down. He still has the Indian garb on. Remember the boarding school images that we looked at earlier? Meant to change them out of that. Moreover, another sort of critique here is another child that's left out. And if you'll notice, that child has sort of a pigtail on him. And this pigtail was representative of that time as a Chinese American. And that child is not even being allowed into this school, and that is in reference to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century. Clearly, this again shows the hypocrisy of the efforts by the United States to civilize the world. But nonetheless, it also shows some of the ideas that we as a nation, the United States, are going to improve these savage, uncivilized nations by going on into them and showing them what it's like to self-govern. Though the United States would control almost 100 islands by the end of the 19th century as a result of the Guano Islands Act, its biggest win, if you will, was as a result of the Spanish-American War. So let's talk about the Spanish-American War. And in order to do this, we're going to start talking about events down in Cuba. Currently under Spanish control, Cubans had made several attempts to free their country. In the latest, on February 24, 1895, the Cubans rebelled again using guerrilla warfare tactics. As a result of this guerrilla uprising between 1895 and 1898, 95,000 Cubans died from war wounds, disease, and starvation in Spanish concentration camps. In fact, stories of the atrocities committed by the Spanish leader in Cuba, a guy by the name of Valeriano Butcher Weyler, reached the United States through what was known as yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, who, even labeled this guy, the Butcher. Yellow journalism was sensationalist newspaper, tabloid newspapers, sort of like the newspapers that you see when you're walking, or the magazines and newspapers that you see when you're going to a grocery store at the checkout line. Those sort of tabloid, the Inquirer and all those. But at this time, they were a little more middle brow. They were actually read by more of the middle class and upper class, so they're very influential during this period in U.S. history. So they were explaining all these terrible atrocities that were being committed in Cuba when over a 3-year period, almost 100,000 Cubans would die. But beyond these humanitarian concerns, there were also sugar and mining interests that had to be explored during this time to understand why the United States will eventually intervene in this conflict in Cuba. Because sugar and mining interests would complain of more than $100 million in lost profits due to the impact of rebellion. As a result of this rebellion, obviously, American and Cuban trade was dwindling more and more every day, and they were losing more than $100 million. So therefore, they were in the president's ear. So here President McKinley has to deal with the public, has to deal with these private corporations who are losing profit, and he has to deal with these yellow journalists led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And again, these are, even though they're tabloid papers, these are very respected publishers. We still have until this day the Pulitzer Prize, which was named after Joseph Pulitzer. These yellow journalists, again, would play up these events in Cuba, but one in particular would have important ramifications for the United States' involvement in this conflict. And that was yellow journalists playing up of the explosion of the USS Maine in the Cuban harbor in early 1898. What the yellow journalists did, without any evidence, was they claimed that it was not an accident. In fact, Hearst's New York Journal even offered $50,000. $50,000 in today's money is $1.3 million. And this $50,000 would be given to anyone who provided evidence that led to the finding of the guilty party who was responsible for the sinking of the USS Maine. Well, eventually, decades later, far after the point, a study conducted by the US Navy in the 1970s actually found that it was an accident. Regardless, the explosion at that time caused the deaths of 266 Americans. Therefore, American blood in the harbor, in the Cuban harbor, the yellow journalist convinced Americans that something had to be done. Even Theodore Roosevelt, during this time, who was an assistant secretary of the Navy, favored war. And he would actually say, even before the sinking of the USS Maine, what you see on the screen. I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. Here's an official of the United States government saying he wants war just because this nation needs it, for no other reason. Well, as for the sinking, Roosevelt described it as, in his words, quote, an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards. And he also encouraged President McKinley to send the Navy to Havana. Soon you would see across the country the following slogan: remember the Maine, remember the Maine. This constant calling, this rallying cry for proponents of war would eventually reach the ears of McKinley, obviously. Now, early on, McKinley did not want to enter this war. So therefore, he was reluctant. And he had some supporters. There was the Anti-Imperialist League. You're going to be reading the document for this class, the Anti-Imperialist League, to understand the other side of this coin. But that Anti-Imperialist League, even though it included some very prominent figures in American history, including Samuel Gompers and even some robber barons, most Americans had that war fervor. The Remember the Maine was really seeping in to American conscience. So as we'll see, by April of 1898, McKinley will ask for a declaration of war. So what we see during this time is the United States going to war. But I want to tell you one other thing before we move ahead with the war itself. And I forgot to put this on the slide, but I want you to pay important attention to what else the government did. Because in addition to approving McKinley's declaration of war in April 1898, Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, T-E-L-L-E-R, the Teller Amendment. And what this did was, it stated America's lack of desire to annex, meaning take over, Cuba. So what we have right here is an effort by the U.S. Congress to tell the world that it has no colonial interest. It is not seeking to create an American empire. I want you to put an asterisk next to this Teller Amendment so you remember it when we talk about what happens after this war. Nonetheless, the war itself, what happens? Well, interestingly enough, 39-year-old Theodore Roosevelt resigns from his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and decides that he is going to become the first to volunteer for the war, among more than 1 million men that do it. He will lead a group known as the Rough Riders, and these Rough Riders were kind of old school cowboys from Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Now, Roosevelt's claim to fame, along with his Rough Riders, was an unplanned charge up San Juan Hill in July that led to an American victory. This war would be far easier than the Civil War, some 3 decades earlier. This splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay called it, lasted just 114 days. And in the process, only 400 combat deaths occurred. In fact, more deaths would come from tropical diseases. About 2,500 deaths would come through that route. But the only problem is, in calling this a splendid little war, is that while the battle in Cuba was quite easy, the war for the Philippines would be far more difficult for the United States. On April 24, 1898, the war spread to the Pacific. Commodore George Dewey was instructed to guide the 9 American naval vessels stationed at Hong Kong to the Philippines. In short order, Dewey defeated the Spanish Navy. Yet he lacked ground troops. As a result, Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino nationalist, took charge of the fighting on island, and in the process declared the country independent in June. Aguinaldo issued a Declaration of Independence and unfurled a red, white, and blue flag as a means of, as you see in this quote from June 1898 by Emilio Aguinaldo, commemorating the flag of the United States of North America as a manifestation of our profound gratitude towards this great nation for its disinterested protection. This is key here because the United States could not have easily as won this conflict in the Philippines without these guerrillas led by Aguinaldo. And Aguinaldo, understandably so, expected this assistance to come at a cost, that cost being Filipino independence. And he would have good relations with the United States. He colored his country's flag, the red, white, and blue, in respect to North America. And he also talked about the United States, in his words, disinterested protection. So he, deep in his heart, believed that the United States would simply walk away. Well, did that happen? Let's see. Because by August of 1898, Spain surrendered in the Pacific. In the aftermath of the war, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. As part of that agreement, the United States could claim Puerto Rico, Guam, and parts of the Samoa in the Pacific as its own. Now here's the very controversial part, particularly if you were Aguinaldo. The United States also purchased the Philippines for $20 million. Cuba, however, would become independent, with very large number of strings attached, as we'll see in a second. And that is in fact what I want to turn to, because what we see is in 1901, the Platt Amendment was passed by Congress. The Platt Amendment stipulated that Cuban treaties required U.S. approval before being signed, and it also gave the United States the right to intervene to ensure domestic tranquility. Therefore, what we see with this Platt Amendment is whether we're talking about internal domestic matters or foreign policy, Cuba essentially has to ask permission from the United States before it can act. Is this independence? Is this self-government? Clearly, no. This is going against the promise that was made in the Teller Amendment that was signed in 1898. In addition, the United States also leased Guantanamo Bay, which to the present day remains a military base on the Cuban island. Next, I want to talk about Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, the 1900 Foraker Act made the island U.S. territory officially. But even though it was U.S. territory, the Puerto Rican people were denied American citizenship, and they were not allowed to ever apply for U.S. statehood. What does this mean? It's clearly, therefore, as a territory, not a part of the United States, but it is also not independent. It cannot become a state, it cannot have its people become U.S. citizens, but yet it is still a territory, and therefore it is not independence. Well, while these nations generally abided by these agreements, the Philippines would not accept being a colony. So between 1899 and 1902, 70,000 U.S. troops would have to be sent to the Philippines to suppress the revolution there. About 16,000 Filipino soldiers were killed, and another 700,000 civilians died of disease and malnutrition. The United States also destroyed homes, crops, and livestock of suspected guerrillas and their supporters. The U.S. military, in contrast, lost 4,196 troops in this battle. This was a dirty war. You can see this image on the left. This image on the left is, if any of you, I know most of you are probably too young to remember this now, but during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, particularly the Iraq War, there was something known as waterboarding, where a towel was put over the face of a suspected terrorist and water was dropped off to simulate drowning. And what we see here in this image from the Philippines is essentially an early form of waterboarding being done to a Filipino insurgent fighting in this battle. Well, in the end, Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, and even though pockets of resistance would continue to fight, this war was essentially over, and America now had possession until the mid-20th century of the Philippines. The question became, would this be a one-shot deal? Would the United States, after 1898, decide to reel in its foreign activities, or would it continue to seek to expand its empire beyond what it took during the Spanish-American War? Well, the answer to that question is it chose the expansion and continued expansion abroad. And we're going to see this in the figure of Theodore Roosevelt, not surprisingly, who will become president in the early 20th century. Well known as a result of his exploits in Cuba with the Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt won the New York governorship in 1898. 2 years later, he would become William McKinley's vice president. Well, McKinley was assassinated in 1901, therefore Roosevelt would become the president. As president, Roosevelt made several attempts to expand America's presence abroad, particularly in Central America. To begin with, we're going to look at Colombia. The United States offered Colombia $10 million to buy a piece of land just 6 miles wide that ran through Panama, a Colombian state. Why was this 6-mile stretch of land so important to the United States? Well, by cutting this portion of the land out, the canal would allow the United States to make a hole and therefore connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, allowing American commercial interest to vastly benefit. Why? Because now no longer would the trade vessels have to go all the way around the bottom of South America. They could simply cut through Central America. Colombia refused this offer. Therefore, Roosevelt aided the Panamanian rebels who supported the canal to break free from Colombia. Eventually, the Panamanian rebels would succeed with the assistance of the United States. They would become free, and the United States would get to build its Panama Canal. Well, this was not enough for Roosevelt. He wanted a larger strategy based on this idea. So what we will see is something you will read for this week, known as the Roosevelt Corollary. In 1904, Roosevelt put forth what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Just to give you a little prehistory of this Roosevelt Corollary, President James Monroe put forth his doctrine in 1823, and in it he stated that the United States would respond to any attempts by European nations to interfere in the affairs of Latin America. In essence, the United States would be a protector of Central America. This changes, however, with Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, because Roosevelt extended this to say that America would now, in his words, exercise international police power, and therefore preemptively, if necessary, meaning before there is any clear or present danger, prevent a Latin American nation from making wrong administrative and economic moves. Therefore, the United States moved from a protector in 1823 to a policeman. As you can see, the policeman Roosevelt in the image to the right, carrying his big stick to beat back any efforts by Central Americans to do as they please in their own domestic affairs, which they had the right to do as self-governing nations, but this is not respected any longer by the United States. This Roosevelt corollary led to massive number of interventions in Central America by the United States over the next 3 decades. In short, the United States would carry out what became known as dollar diplomacy in the region, meaning that it would control the trade and finance of countries, but not turn these nations into colonies. When these financial interests were threatened, the United States would physically intervene in one form or another. And you can see all the places that the United States intervened during this time. The most, Honduras, 7 times, followed by Guatemala, 6 times, Panama, 6 times, Cuba, 4 times, the Dominican Republic, 4 times. Repeated interventions in Central America. Therefore, it begs the question, could the United States still be classified as a nation that opposed empires and was itself not an empire? It's hard to make that point after what we saw in this lecture.